All right. Hey, welcome to the show, everybody. My name is Mike. It is Wednesday afternoon, which means it's time for another episode of the Leadership Toolkit. As you know, your definitive leadership training podcast. I always have the opportunity to interview some absolutely phenomenal guests from all different verticals of business. And today is no exception. I've got the amazing Matt McCarthy. Matt's the founder and president of Questful. They're a coaching and business consulting firm. And so what he's focused on is the quest and mission of purpose. And Matt's experience has over 25 years of business transformation combined with 10 years of studying achievement, well-being, health from all different directions, people's psychology. These are things we need in leadership. And then his latest project in the last 5 years, he spent studying the reasons we get stuck in achieving our goals and how to break through those areas. So I could not be more excited right now to welcome the amazing and achieving Matt McCarthy. Matt, welcome to the show today, man.
Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Absolutely. I really look forward to having a conversation with you. And if you would, I always dive right in immediately. If you would take a few minutes and just share with our audience, who you are, what your background is. I know you better than I know you. We met just a few minutes ago, and I'm super excited to have this conversation. But if you would jump in and share a little bit of that background, it would be great. And then we'll have a conversation, man.
Sure. Well, you went through the basics in the bio. I think what I'll do is rather than start at the beginning, I'm going to actually start before the beginning.
Okay.
Which is a strange way to approach this. But you mentioned in my bio that I spent about 5 years studying the reasons why we get stuck. And there are some simple ways of stating it, but it's not a simple question. And the answers
Sure.
are not simple either. About a year ago in this, and I'll overuse the word quest, so forgive me for that, but in this quest to figure out why I have become stuck in various places in the past, I encountered a few pieces of literature that brought me to the idea of trauma. Trauma gets sent around a lot, spoken about casually, but there's also been a lot of good literature and studies done around trauma that I came across, a few particular works. I also came across some information from my own background, which is where I go before the beginning, that ties this back together. Turns out I was adopted, which I knew. What I didn't know is that during her pregnancy, my birth mother went through some major traumatic event. And I don't know if everybody is aware, but things like stress and fear chemicals, hormones, actually go from the mother to the baby during that. So right then, I had an experience without knowing what was going on, where I was flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and those things actually get hardwired into the body. And then if you fast forward a little bit to when I was born, I mentioned I was adopted. I wasn't adopted immediately. When I was born, the legal process was slow, and I think I spent about 10 weeks or so in what you would call a receiving home, which is like a temporary orphanage.
Okay.
There, I wasn't getting parental love and care. So what that does is, there have been many studies around this, is it amounts to parental neglect. I did get fed, changed, all the physical needs, but not that parental care. And just that short period of time was actually enough to create a disadvantage. So just right there, without going into the rest of my story, I had two major things working against me from the perspective of goal accomplishment, mental health, just personal fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
So you said you like to dive right in. I dove right in. That's
Absolutely. So let me ask you, and like I said, I sit here and I take notes, and I want to take it all in. One of the things that I find interesting, can we go back at the very beginning? Because you said, hey, I want to, talk some about trauma and the stress and fear hormones. Like, you're going back before the beginning. I think when most people hear the word trauma, right, we think of an event. We think of, well, there's this thing, this one event that happened to me. At least that's how I'm framing it. And I think a lot of people, probably similarly to me, you're defining it a little bit differently. Can you give me a broader definition? Because you're saying, hey, look, go back before that, and there's these other factors. So what else adds to, how would you define trauma, and what are the other things that add to that?
Yeah, that's a super good question. I tend to define trauma as having three attributes. So one is there is an event or a string of events that is either threatening or directly harmful to ourselves or someone around us that we're watching. So
Okay.
that's very much a necessity. The second is we have to have a lack of control in the situation. So zero agency or very little agency. So you
Okay.
might even think of a situation where a person witnesses another person's accidental death. It might be extremely shocking. It doesn't happen to them, but they are aware of it. They see this happen and they cannot do a single thing about it. And then the third thing is a lack of comfort, meaning there is no one around to help soothe you, and you don't have the capability inside of yourself to do so. So
Okay.
that's how I break it down. But that also kind of brings up a question which you were alluding to. There are different types of trauma.
Sure.
And the categories that I'll give you are kind of my own informal categories. You'll find other, say, researchers who may phrase it differently. But you have the traumatic incidents that might trigger PTSD, for example. So a battlefield type of situation, or an assault, or something of that nature.
Sure.
You also have developmental trauma, and that can be a single traumatic event or a string of traumatic events that happen in the childhood. Most often it's talked about, say, prior to age 5 or so, prior to our real memories starting. But that can actually go anytime through our development, which is reasonably considered up to about age 25. So if we're experiencing a string of mistreatment during that, or some very early developmental things, like I mentioned, the receiving home,
Mm-hmm.
that gets imprinted on the body for long term. Some others would be generational trauma. And this might be a situation where, say, a parent or a grandparent's previous traumatic events get passed down to the children, either through their behavior or through epigenetics, which for the space of time, it's how the genes express themselves. Scientific discussion for another day.
Sure.
And then there's also cultural trauma. So that might be trauma that's experienced collectively. And rather than trying to define it, I'll give you more examples. That might
Sure.
be, so COVID, that was a cultural trauma that was pretty much worldwide. Everybody experienced it in different ways, in different degrees. The Great Recession would be another one. So
Sure.
those are the main ones that I would discuss.
So just to recap, and I always recap to make sure that I'm hearing correctly. So you mentioned, PTSD, which is more of a distinct sort of what I'm hearing, sort of a distinct event trauma, where you don't have, you don't have the control, you don't have someone to comfort you, and hey, this is one thing that happens. Then you mentioned developmental, which is from childhood. You mentioned generational, passed down, generation to generation, and then cultural, which is the on that massive scale. So I'm curious, and I want to tie this together on a couple of different things. One is, so why? Because this has been your quest to discover these things, and as we talk here on the Leadership Toolkit, why is it important for somebody, especially moving into a leadership role, to acknowledge, what their trauma may be or how they've experienced? What is important when you're moving into a leadership or management role in business about this?
Yeah, great question. Great question, Mike. There's two main reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One is kind of the old adage, know thyself. If you don't understand yourself and why you behave the way you do, you're going to spill the effects of what you exhibit, your behaviors, on other people, for better or for worse.
You're going to help create some
So
trauma for others.
that's very true. And in the corporate world, I've seen that happen many times. So we obviously don't want to do that. And to me, that feels like the baseline reason. The other reason is, as a leader, you may be leading and encountering people who have gone through their own set of trauma. I think leaders need to be prepared with this kind of information, not necessarily to be a counselor to somebody else who has gone through trauma, but at least to understand that if somebody has, even if it's not shared explicitly, to be able to recognize somebody who's gone through trauma, that may be what makes a person better or worse at a certain role. And it's not necessarily that somebody is a lazy employee. It might be that they have been traumatized in some way that shuts down their ability to work in a certain type of role. And if you shift them 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, you may be able to get them out of that trauma residual zone, and they may increase their performance, or at least have a more fulfilling time in their role.
Sure. So, and I love the first part where you said, hey, know thyself. Like, you have to know, what your emotions are, what your triggers are. For the second piece, I wrote down, you got to know others, right? You have to know others. You have to know people. You have to like people. I remember early on when I started this podcast, a friend of mine, Ian, brought up, he says, man, he goes, you can't lead people if you don't like people. And I think fast forward here, another 50 episodes after that interview, Matt, as you and I are talking, I think there is no replacement for genuine caring. You do have to like people. You do have to listen to people. You have to know where they're coming from. So let's say that you have somebody that you think, okay, hey, they've experienced this, or they're not performing the way that I want them to. It's easy. Lots of people, I think, in leadership roles. And again, I know I'm coming from my own model of the world, right? let me,
Aren't we all?
but yeah, we all are. But a lot of people that are in leadership roles, and especially in business, CEOs, top level leaders, presidents, vice presidents, etc., they have that type A personality, right? That it's like, well, we just got to go, or we just got to do this, we just got to break through it. How would you advise somebody that is in one of those leadership roles? Say I'm engaging with somebody and they're just not producing, and I feel like I've done all the things, and maybe I'm starting to think, well, maybe it's because how this person is wired. Maybe they've experienced something that I haven't experienced. What is your approach to engage with that employee, that follower, that person, to be able to help them grow past it?
So the first thing you would need to do would be do your homework on that person. I don't mean go back and check their social media or any silly thing like that. I'm talking about, what is their performance like? Not only are they doing poorly, but what areas are they excelling? Because when you're able to contrast where they're excelling, or at least doing well, as opposed to where they're substandard, then you start to get an idea of what may be going on with them without really knowing the specifics. And then I would highly recommend starting to have a series of conversations. When you have these conversations, I'm not talking about you're starting a performance review with them. I'm talking about a casual conversation to start to get to know that person better. You're not going to want to dig into what their specific traumatic events were, especially if they may encroach on, say, some sort of HR or personal privacy type of area. But you want to get to know them better. Get to know them well enough that they understand that you actually do care about them. Doesn't matter if you like them or not, but if you care about them. And then start getting them opening up about situations where they did excel or felt like they excelled, felt lit up, felt really good about things. That will start to at least illuminate areas that they may be better functionally fit for. It may also bring up some areas that they recognize that they're short on, and may not even express a desire to improve on. Those will tend to lean toward where their trauma was. So you can guide them through a process without telling them that you're guiding them through a process, to where you can identify what's going to help them. If they are great at the actual work, but they don't respond well to you pushing them on the work, then great. That gives you a very good clue. Okay, they do better with encouragement than they do with pushing. Okay,
Sure.
that we can work around that.
Well, I think it's interesting you bring that up. And there are a lot of people that do well with encouragement. I've said this on numerous shows, and I sort of, there's times I say it tongue in cheek, like, oh, well, hey, as leaders, we view it, and you can't take hugs and high fives out of the ATM. But then there's also times that you look and go, well, you kind of, if you're depositing into those individuals properly with the hugs and the high fives and the encouragement and the acknowledgement of the positive stuff. And you and I were talking before the stream, I have a daughter that's a competitive gymnast, and she's one that she responds so much better to the accolades of the little things that she's doing well. And I always liken this to being a parent. I think there's so many parallels in business and parenting and leadership. But she
Absolutely.
responds so much better, and you will get more out of her. And I think that's a lot alike for many individuals than if you're coming down on, well, you just got to do this because I said so. And so I think what it takes, one of the things that I'm hearing you say, Matt, is it really takes us having a human moment. It takes us, outside of because you said this early on, it doesn't have to be an official performance review. It also doesn't have to be an official warning slip, right?
Absolutely.
It just takes us having a human moment and connecting with someone and looking them in the eyes and saying, hey, what's going on with you? And let them tell you. Because I think given, and I think you would agree with this, like, given those right moments, if you're looking somebody in the eyes and having a conversation, if you ask the right questions, people will tell you exactly what you need to know to coach them, to grow them, to move them forward. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I do want to not dance around. Careful about the HR encroachment.
Sure.
But anything beyond that, absolutely. We humans are built for connection. And if we don't
Absolutely.
have a connection with our leaders, whether it's at the next level up or, throughout the organization, it's a machine. And we don't perform as well. You can't throw it into an ROI calculation. It doesn't do very well. You might be able to find some Gallup studies that kind of prove me wrong, but I've done so many cost analysis models and tried to build in the human improvement into it. It just doesn't pencil out, but it's there. It's real.
So I don't want to run away from this question too. And I agree with exactly with what you're saying. We were sort of joking before we went online here, and I'll use myself as an example. There's some stuff I'm just too old or maybe too cranky past it. And so one of the things you pointed out, you said, well, avoiding the HR thing. What do you mean by the staying within the HR guidelines if you're having a conversation with somebody?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you honed in on that
Sure.
one. Some people experience trauma that's related to, say, sexual assault. And
Okay.
having that discussion in the workplace, especially if there's any prompting by the leader or manager, can be sensed as uncomfortable and certainly could be reported by the trauma survivor to HR.
Sure.
So that would be a specific. There may be other scenarios that are similar.
No, and I think that's a very good point, because that like for me, that's not where my head went. I'm always right on the edge. Like if there's black over here, there's white over here. I live in the 80% gray area for myself, because it's like, hey, you can move forward and you can do a lot of these things. And as you said that, I honed in on it, because I'm thinking, okay, well, on one side, I'm saying, hey, have this human moment, have this conversation. I do think that it's important, because this show, this podcast, I advise leaders and managers and people that are in business. And I think it's important to acknowledge too, sort of the business climate that we live in. If that conversation goes beyond a human moment, and Matt, I think you bring up a good point. If it goes beyond just having that human moment conversation, where it really is something serious, where it is, that person does want to open up and have that discussion, I think it's worth having either another trusted advisor available and there with you, or inviting HR. Like in my business, I always just call up HR and I'm like, hey, you're gonna need to come down for this conversation. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I think that's one way, speaking very frankly, and just my opinion, that is one way to show that other person that you really do care. Hey, look, I care. I want to listen to you, but I also don't want to create a situation that might be might make either of us uncomfortable, or put one or both of us or the company at risk. So I think that's a really good point that you bring up there. And again, for anybody listening to the podcast, this is friend advice. We're just having a conversation. This is not legal advice. I'll preface it with that. One thing also, before I get too far ahead, I always do this. I get 20 minutes, 30 minutes into the show, and then I realize, as Matt and I are having this conversation, if you want to be able to connect with him, and I think he's absolutely awesome, just a ton of wisdom and insight, especially when it comes to, achievement and overcoming trauma and moving forward in business, moving your life to the next level. Make sure you can connect with him on LinkedIn. He and I talked beforehand. Yeah. And the one thing I realized, Matt, I didn't put the website in here. I'll pull that, I think, off of it's your Questful website, so people can connect with you there. But on LinkedIn, if you just look up Matt McCarthy, and it's MK McCarthy, spelled MKMCCARTHY, is the LinkedIn link there. So for anybody listening to the podcast afterwards, also make sure you connect with him there. So I want to move back, because earlier you said know thyself. And what if, as a leader, what are maybe 2 or 3 different tactical things, because you've studied this stuff and you've studied it extensively. What are a couple of tactical things if I realize, hey, I need work in this area, or I humble myself to the point to acknowledge, hey, I do have this trauma and I've got to overcome it. What are some methods that somebody should use to begin breaking through that trauma and start the next part of their journey?
So that's the question of the hour, honestly, Mike.
Absolutely.
So there's a number of directions to take this. Okay. So I'll break it up into short-term and long-term. If you've endured trauma, the deal is that trauma actually gets imprinted into your body, and it's something that you don't simply forget or mentally overcome. So you end up having to have short-term strategies that help you in the moment or in that day. And then you also have to have longer-term strategies that you carry out. And before I get into these strategies, I'll explain something that may help as I elaborate. Sure. When you're a trauma survivor, unless you have already gone through this process, you likely still have the residual of trauma in your body. And that sounds weird, but what that really means is that your hormonal patterns, your neurology is now encoded with that trauma. So you're going to have a tendency to have higher cortisol, higher adrenaline. Your nerves are going to be in a state of what I call alert. It's kind of like when you arm your house or your car alarm. It's an alert watching for a threat, even if you don't consciously think of things in terms of a threat. So the other thing that happens is when a threat actually appears, you go into a scenario where you have where you get into an alarm state. So that alarm went off. The sensor got triggered. That alarm went off. So the alert state is just this kind of a predisposition toward fear, okay, or some sort of fear behavior. And then the alarm state is where your body goes into, we commonly know it as the fight or flight response. Technically, it actually gets beyond that. Fight, flight, fear, and fawn are the 4 stages. And again, I'm taking a little bit to explain this because it'll make the tactical a lot easier when we get there. So
I think it's great.
Yeah. So fight or flight are pretty basic, but basically, if you're in a situation where you're encountered with a threat, just think of it in terms of you're encountering a lion. Okay, if you're encountering a lion, your first thing is you're going to run. You're going to flee. Okay,
right.
Fight or flight. If you cannot flee, you're cornered. The best thing you can do is fight it until you get to a point where you can flee. Okay, our body is naturally encoded to do those things. And then the fear and fawn response are ones that come into play where you have no agency in the situation, where you have no control. So the freeze, you literally freeze. Think of a possum playing dead. Mm-hmm. You can literally freeze, and there are degrees of that when we look at humans. And then fawning is a sense of actually, I'm still working on the right wording for this. Somebody else can word it better, but effectively bowing to your threat. You're almost giving in and going along with it. So, so those of us who've encountered trauma, we tend to skip right over the fight or flight because we've been trained in this learned helplessness. Those traumatic events where we had no control, those were encoded in us, and we realized, okay, taking control is just not an option. So what do we do? And again, we're not thinking through this. This happens out of reflex. So we actually go into a freeze state, which means we effectively, as humans, become numb. We may go quiet. We may literally not be able to move our arms or legs. And obviously, this doesn't work out too well when you're trying to accomplish something. Sure. And then fawn is basically giving into, think of it like a workplace situation where you have a boss, a manager, a leader who wants you to do something that you disagree with. And instead of standing up or leaving, you give in. You go along with it. You may even do it with a big smile. So those are kind of the 4 stages.
Gotcha.
And that's what happens when you're in alert.
So that you said that's our sort of alert state. That's when it's built into our neurology. And yeah. So fight, flight, and I think you did a really good job explaining that, because I as you're talking, I'm thinking of my own situations, right? What are the times where I've pushed back? What are the times where I've ran? And then you said fear. I mean, the fear state, to me, it's where our brain is telling us all the things that could go wrong, but probably are never going to, type of deal. Is that, I mean, because it's just
more of a freeze state.
Okay.
It's more a freeze state. So we're not even really able to analyze it that well. We may even get stuck in a very narrow thought pattern.
Okay.
Which might be something like, I can't do this. I can't do this. I shouldn't be here. I can't do this. But you're frozen almost literally. So you can't get out of it until the threat is over and you kind of get a chance to calm down a little bit.
So the fear and freeze state are I just made up a word. They sort of dance together. is what
Well,
you're saying. Is that, am I
the
hearing that right?
fear. So there isn't necessarily a fear state. Encompasses the entire alarm alert type of
Got you.
scenario.
Okay.
So it would be fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And if I
Got it.
said that incorrectly at the beginning, I apologize. But fight,
Okay.
flight, freeze, and fawn.
So once you've acknowledged that, once we said, okay, this is what it is, and I know that, because mentally, and you made the comment, you said this is one of those things you can't just overcome mentally necessarily, right? You don't just like for me, I'm very much that personality that I'm like, I'm just going to put my head down and run through that wall. And
Yeah.
so once you realize, okay, this is one of those things that I can't just run through the wall, that I have to accept that this is something else. So then what are the tactical pieces you brought up, short term and long term? What are a few short term and maybe what are a few long term tactical items that I should say, okay, well, let me put my eggs in that basket so that I can overcome this?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing it back to this, Mike, because
Sure.
again, this is the heart of the matter. So the first one is if you are actually in that alarm state, that's when everything's heightened. You're getting into the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. I actually have a simple exercise that I do myself when I get
Okay.
into the situation. I can kind of just walk through it. Just takes a
Yeah.
second. I will actually stop whatever it is that I'm doing. Hopefully, I'm not in a meeting or something. But if I'm by myself, I will stop what I'm doing. I'll take a moment to make sure I'm sitting relatively straight. I will breathe in through my nose. Try and make it, say, 4, 5, 6 seconds if I can. And I will hold it for about 2 seconds. And then I'll let it out as slowly as I can, maybe 6, 7, 8, 9 seconds. And then I will take what put me into that alarm state, and it's usually not an actual lion. So we have the luxury of doing this. And I determine what is one thing that I can actually do related to this alarm state. I had a situation, I also dabble in real estate, and I had a deal that was looking like it was about to fall apart. And I had been working on this for way too long.
Sure.
So I first panicked when I got the news that it was possibly falling apart. So I did sit and I took that breath and I thought, okay, what is one thing that I can do? And because I had given myself that breath, that had actually calmed down my nervous system a little bit. And it allowed me to at least think a little bit.
Okay.
And I thought of one resource that I could call. And I did. And it turns out that they had a lead for a solution.
That's good.
And that was able to level me down. Followed the thread and was able to make it work out after all. But that's my one breath, one thing.
No, I like that a lot. And I think it's so easy when we have these conversations. I think so often, especially we get into these levels, for yourself, like you're a speaker and a CEO and you run a company, and a lot of people that are going to watch the show, we're in the throes of business, right? And you're at this high level. And I think it's a lot of times it's just distilling things down to a simple solution, because this is something that everybody can do at any time. We so often, I've shared this analogy before, that like we so often are looking so far past it. We're climbing this ladder, like you're saying, hey, I'm trying to make this deal, and we're climbing and climbing and climbing. We're looking so far past it, and I go, oh my gosh, I can't get all the way up there. But the reality is the next rung is right here. I'm just looking so far past it that I missed that opportunity. And this is something that is just so simple. You take a step back and you say, okay, well, hey, breathe, right? You said, would you say your one breath, one thing solution? And the reality is, I think most people can do that in most any situation. I mean, for goodness sake, I remember collectively, I remember as you're sharing this, I had a general sales manager. This is, gosh, 10 or 12 years ago. And I don't remember what was going on. I think it's one of those things that it's like in the moment, the whole world is coming down, right? We're working financing, we're working credit with customers, and the power goes out.
Wow.
And I remember him say, and we had a showroom full of customers. I was working in the automotive industry, had a showroom full of customers. And this is like 10, 12. And ironically, we just had the power go out this past week in one of our stores, which is wild. It's probably why this is top of mind. But I remember him, and everyone's like, we got customers all over. We're trying to do finance. We're trying to do this. Oh my gosh, what do we do? And I remember him looking up and just really calmly saying, well, the best thing we can do right now, guys, panic. And it's like, because he said the thing that flew in the face of what we really should be doing, something like
Yeah.
this, like, hey, just look, just sit back and take a deep breath and think, okay, well, what is one thing we could do? Well, listen, you can still go take customers and go drive cars. You can still fill the time with something. Like, the reality is the power's not going to be out forever, right?
Yeah.
And so those situations, it's just like you're sharing, you're saying, hey, okay, what can I do? And this deal's going to fall apart. What's one resource I can leverage? Should it just be that? And so often we overlook the simple things that it's like, should it be, or could it be just that I'm going to pick up the phone and call that customer or call that one person and explain to
Mhm.
them exactly what's going on? But we fear the answer, right? That's where we
Yeah.
get locked up. And so I think that's absolutely excellent. That's a great
Yeah.
short term. What would you recommend as a long term? And I'm sorry, did you have something else to share on that?
Well, so in terms of short term, that's the immediate.
Sure.
There are things that you can do in the short term to keep the alert level lower. And
Okay.
I'll be much more brief with those, and then I'll get into long term practices as
Yeah, I
well.
love it.
But in the short term, um, doing basic things like getting some regular activity, meaning, each day getting out for a walk, a workout, whatever, um, eating appropriately. We send our nervous systems all awry if we put a whole bunch of chemicals and sugar and such in our bodies. So
Hmm.
we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure.
Right.
Um, even even doing some things like a daily mindfulness or meditation or gratefulness type of exercise. It helps keep your nervous system reactivity down.
Sure.
So you have farther to go before you get in that alarm state.
No, I love all that as well. It's interesting because as I've talked with, I've had several different experts on the show, and when we talk about, like, okay, for example, like, how do you start your day, right? How do you, and I think that's one of the things that I'm hearing from you is, okay, well, so, even at the very beginning of the show, you said, well, let me go back before, and so the
Mm-hmm.
thing is, it's like, even now, if you go back before that fight or flight, before that alert situation happens, if you're making a conscious decision as a leader, as a powerful individual, that I'm saying, okay, I'm going to make my decision that this is how I'm going to set the tone of my day. You're saying, hey, the proper food and nutrients, like, that's a lifestyle, right? The regular activity for me, I every morning, right here in my phone, I got a little app that I jump in and I share what are three things that I'm grateful for. I always have my morning prayer. That's me, whether it's prayer or meditation. I've no problem having conversations about lots of things like that when it becomes to religion, faith, things that don't line up perfectly in religion or faith. I think a lot of it for me always comes back to that, but that's one guy's opinion. Um, I always have that prayer because it allows me the opportunity to have a conversation with God. And then you brought up meditation. Meditation's the opportunity to actually take the time to listen, for him to speak
Mm-hmm.
back to you and say, hey, here's what you need to be doing. Some people will say, oh, it's listening to your body or listening to the universe. I really think that it's an opportunity for God to talk back. If I'm asking him for things all the time and I'm never listening, then it's like, well, what the heck, right?
Absolutely.
So I think super valuable advice there. And it does take um, it goes to the source of the fact that leadership is not a title. You first have to lead yourself. You first have to, you said again, I know I'm going to lean on this some, Matt, but know thyself, right? If you know yourself, you have to know that I've got to do this activity. I've got to have my gratitude journal. I've got to feed my mind and my body properly so that I can be in a good leadership role. And then I think that's the pre-work, right? That's the stuff setting yourself up for success. I think that's great. So long term, what are some other, I mean, I know some of those, food and nutrients, to me, that falls in long term too. Like I said, that's a lifestyle. Are there one or two other things that you might recommend to somebody? Hey, here's something you should be doing on a regular basis to break through.
Yeah, definitely. There's one actual big thing that can get applied in a lot of ways that I look at from a long-term perspective. And with proper attribution, I get this from a scholar named Greg McEwen. It's something called essentialism. Now,
Okay.
not that everybody has to follow essentialism to a T, but the concept comes basically from there. And that is creating space in your life. So that space needs to be in four different areas. One is your time, two is your emotions, three is your mental capacity, and four is your finances. And again, this is going back down to keeping that alert level low. Okay, but you're doing it in a longer term manner, which is going to make it much more stable. So I'll give you an example from each of those areas, and I'll try and be brief with each. But
Yeah, that's great.
creating time, I'll say this in a business context. If you are going to meetings back to back to back to back, which happens, you may have 8 hours straight. You are not creating. I think probably, well, I have, probably everybody listening has. If you do not create space, whether it's some half-hour buffers or even 5-minute buffers between meetings, you don't have any time to process what's been done, what you're doing next. You're also not going to have time to appropriately feed your body, to have that time for prayer or meditation or just space creating in your head. So creating time for yourself. That may also mean setting yourself up so you're not 16 hours a day on your work, your company, your job. Maybe something more appropriate for you as a trauma survivor is 7 hours. That's it. That's all you, that's your capacity. And leaving time buffers in between events during that as well. So that's one. If you look at mental capacity, if you take on more things, meaning more roles within your company, more businesses as an entrepreneur, more activities as in your personal life, each of those things takes up space in your brain, takes up bandwidth, if you will. And it makes it harder to focus on any one of those things. So being aware of how many things you have going on, I mean, frankly, just list them out in your life. And normally you should come up with a few. You have your role as a parent, you have your role as a spouse, you have your role at work, you have your role in some extracurricular, maybe it's a role at your church or some civic activity. And that can be plenty. I listed mine out and I had a page full of major things that I was doing. And I'm like, okay, something has got to give. And so I've gone through a process of deliberately either merging things, cutting things out, deciding, okay, what is, to go back to the book, essential? What is truly essential? But kind of going through that process to make sure that you're not overwhelming your brain. It's really hard to make decisions when you're overwhelming your brain. You just can't think straight. It's even worse when you get into your alarm state. You cannot do anything. And that's not where you want to be as a responsible person.
100%. So one of the things you said was creating space. You said time, emotion, mental, and finances.
Yeah.
Touch on emotion. How do you create space in your emotional state?
Well, one would actually be some of the exercises we talked about before, whether it's meditation, prayer, mindfulness, gratitude, things of that nature.
Sure.
It allows you to take some of the emotion out of what's going on in your life, because you're just really thinking through, or at least taking some of the negative emotion out of your life. You're thinking
Sure.
through what's good in your life, what you're kind of taking thought out of it, which also takes emotion out of it.
Sure.
So that's helpful. But you can also look at what are the activities that you're involved in, not just the quantity and not just the level of effort, but are there ones that are actually raising your emotion level? Okay. If you have one or two that make you positively very passionate, I would vouch for that's a great thing. But
Sure. I
if you
agree.
have 7 or 8 of those and then 10 that are just a complete swing in the negative, it's not a good situation. We can't avoid having things in our lives that bring us into a negative emotion space, but we can avoid adding things in or doing optional things that bring us into a negative space. So basically taking an inventory of that as well and working through how to adjust it so you do have emotional space to breathe, so that you can still do your one breath, one thing, but
Sure.
you just don't want to have to every time.
Absolutely. And how about financial? Because you said you got to create financial
Mhm.
space.
Yeah, and financial is specific because it becomes a huge source of stress. So it actually
Mm-hmm.
feeds into some of the other things, our time and our emotions. So I deliberately point out the financial. The how to is fairly simple, not always easy, but the fairly simple is you are creating room by having, say, savings set aside. You create an emergency savings account. I'll give you an example. Say you have a medical bill that comes up. It's not covered by insurance.
Sure.
Suddenly you have
We'll
to
have that.
shell out $2,000 or $10,000, and you might be a month away from bankruptcy as it is. And I've met a lot of leaders, professionals that do run themselves that tightly.
Mm-hmm.
So if that bill comes up, even if it's not bankruptcy threatening, it's definitely creating stress in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So by having that savings account, you can draw from it and just then replenish it as you go. Same thing with debt. The more debt you have, the less buffer you have in your
Sure.
finances. You might have credit limit, but that's just going to kick the can down the road.
No, I
So,
I I
and
love that. I appreciate you taking the time really to share through all that. There's so much good information here, Matt. It's really phenomenal. And I think this is something that leaders take note. Man, it is important to do these things Matt's talking about. Like you got to take inventory. You have to take the time. We're running so fast, so far every single day. And like even as you're saying now, like one breath, one thing, just I mean that takes 20 seconds of your day, and that 20 seconds could give so much more of your day back to you if you take the time. I think that's a great exercise. One thing you wanted to mention, let me pull this up. You were talking about an assessment. We were talking, and is that a trauma assessment? Because we're kind of coming to the tail end here, so I wanted to bring that up so it doesn't get overlooked.
oh
um
yeah, so I created for anybody who is starting to think about this and starting to see, okay, look, maybe this is me, but I didn't even really recognize it before.
sure.
So I created a one-page assessment. It's not official. It hasn't been studied, but it's to give you an idea across the parameters that I was talking about, how much trauma and the residual from trauma is impacting your ability to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. And so, as you put up on screen, if you would just text the word assessment to 33777, you'll get that assessment. Highly encourage you take it. And I include a link to my Calendly at the bottom of it. So if you end up
Perfect.
wanting to chat about it. So I do coach people in this area. So I'm open to taking some additional clients at this point. Oh, by the way, if companies are interested, organizations are interested, I do also speak on this topic. So they can reach directly out to me through LinkedIn. Happy to do so.
Yes, and I'll make sure forgive me. We got to talking, and I'm sitting here taking notes. I'll make sure and include your website in the show notes and in the YouTube description and so forth as well. I would definitely encourage everybody, because just this brief conversation with Matt is so revealing, and I'm gonna text you afterwards because I want to take the assessment and see how that works. And so definitely, if anybody's listening, it's text the word assessment, ASSESSMENT, to 33777. Matt can help you navigate through that. You can connect with him on his website. Again, connect with Matt on LinkedIn. Just an absolute wealth of knowledge, and it's linkedin.com/n/MKMCCARTHY. It's MK McCarthy. You can connect with him, but you're easy to find. When I put in Matt McCarthy, you're the top one coming up. So any final thoughts to take us out today, Matt?
Honestly, just what I left you with before. I mean, if you take nothing away from this, it's just know thyself, know other people, and one breath, one thing.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, if you would do me a favor and just hang out for a minute, I'm going to go ahead and take us out. Thank you so much for your time today, man. You've been very, very helpful, very, very wise on the subject.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. And folks, that's going to bring us to a close for another episode of the Leadership Toolkit. Thank you so much for your time. As always, all I want to do is provide you with awesome information. And if you've gained something out of this show, please do me a favor, leave a thumbs up on the YouTube video. If you're on the Spotify listening or on Apple iTunes, make sure that you leave a positive thumbs up, leave a review. Share this episode, share the show with someone that could use this information. That's one of the only ways that the show and the podcast continue to grow. We have amazing, amazing guests, just like Matt, every single week. And please share that out with someone that you think could use the information. I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. I hope you've gained some growth out of this episode. And until we speak next, everybody, stay great. Talk to you soon.